And we are live here in the Storycraft Cafe. I am your host, Hank Garner, as always, and I would love to welcome our guest today, Clemence Michallon. She has an amazing new book. It's called The Quiet Tenant, and there's a glare on it right there. This book is one of the most interesting um, fresh looks at a genre that has that we all love, and but there have been lots of stories like this told, but none in the way that you told it, and I absolutely love it and so excited to talk about it. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your kind words. I'm really
Oh,
glad you loved the book and that it resonated with you.
absolutely. We love to start the show with a fun question sometimes, just to kind of get things started. And one question I love to ask people is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, I love that question. And I love it especially because I have a very specific answer. Um, I was in primary school. I must have been around 7 years old.
Okay.
And I was a kid who learned how to read pretty early on. And so I was already reading books, but it had never dawned on me that if books existed, it meant that someone had to write them. And
Right.
then one day at school, our teacher put up a little poster on the blackboard. It was, I think, an illustration from a children's book publishing company, that had put it out as a way to advertise the books in schools. And it was a drawing of a squirrel in a tree with a little bird hovering near the squirrel. And she asked us to imagine what they were telling each other, the squirrel and the bird. And I remember she suggested, she said, maybe the bird or the squirrel needs direction and the other animal is providing them. And I totally took that idea. I stole it. And so I wasn't even very creative that day, but just the sitting down and writing that conversation, that scenario. Oh, why do the squirrel need directions? Why is the bird helping? That was so fun. And I remember that was the day I realized, wow, writing is so fun. Writing creatively was the most fun I ever had. And that's when I came home and I declared that I wanted to be a writer.
That is so fun. How old were you then?
7.
7.
Yeah.
And you've been a writer ever since.
Exactly. you know, then as a kid, I would write little stories. As a teenager, I would write some bad poetry. And then,
Oh,
and then finally, it took years to, figure out how to finish a novel length work and then how to write a novel that actually works on the page.
trust me, no one listening to this has ever gone through a bad poetry phase. It's
No, no one.
right, right. You this is your first novel, is that right?
So it's
But
my first sorry, it's my
no,
first
no, go ahead.
thriller, and it's my first novel in English, but I am French originally, and I did publish a novel in French in the September of 2020 that was not a thriller. It was a literary novel about a female bodybuilder who has to manage her sister's bakery for a few weeks and it wrecks her life.
I can imagine. Is that going to be released in English?
No, no plans
No.
of yet. So people just need to learn French.
I'll get right on that. Um, but you have worked as a journalist between then and writing thrillers now. Um, I have come to know quite a bit uh, of journalists that are people that spent time in journalism that went on to write fiction. And you would think, on the surface that journalism and fiction shouldn't have much to do with each other, but I'm interested in the toolkit that a journalist picks up along the way. And one way that I like to describe it is like if you're in a larger city and a newsworthy event happens, there might be five different reporters that show up to cover the same event. And for their various newspapers or television stations or whatever. And even though they're reporting on the same event, they all have a little different perspective. They see it with their own eyes, they interpret it with their brain, and the reporting will come out, even though the facts are all the same, there may be nuances that are different. So your time as a journalist, do you feel like that you picked up any special tools or skills that now help you as a fiction writer?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, first of all, one of the great blessings of a career in journalism when you're a writer for a publication is that you learn to switch it on and off, right? The writing, you do learn to just sit down and write, and that's one of the biggest hurdles I think that we have to get over when we're starting out as writers is writing through the bad first draft and accepting, just getting the words on the page and fixing them later. And so my first experiences of finishing work and being edited, welcoming someone else onto the page with me and preparing the work to be read by the public, all these experiences happened for me in journalism. And that did a lot of work for me later on. Uh, I am a writer who, I'm a word count girl. I sit down and I want to do 500 words or 1,000 words when I'm writing fiction, and that came from my journalism career, because it's all about the word counts there, and it also just prepares you for an experience that can be jarring sometimes of publishing your work, having other people chime in, and some people receive it well and some people don't get it, and it's all part of the process. It's all normal. And if you do journalism long enough, it just becomes such a natural part of your writing life that you just accept it completely and it doesn't jar quite as much when it keeps happening. And another thing is, for me as a crime fiction writer, I've covered true crime as a journalist, and so I was able to build a sort of a personal library of knowledge, uh, and an understanding of how things work and how things happen that I feel has served me well when I have sat down to write novels.
So one thing that I think a lot of new novelists struggle with is the idea of holding your work too precious. Like, that every word that I craft it's this creation that came from my very soul, and I can't change it. And you learn after doing this enough that yeah, it's not as precious as you think. The whole work may be, but the details usually can handle some work.
Yeah, absolutely. And then it becomes part of the fun. I think journalism and even those early experiences of being edited as a novelist, you come to understand that it's fun to remove some passages so that other passages can shine, and it's fun to make some cuts so that the pacing works better. And it's immensely rewarding to look at a piece of work that you and another person have made better together. I remember when I started out in journalism, one of my very first internships, I had a really excellent boss, who was my editor in the newsroom, and he would print every article I wrote, every long form, and sit down with me and ret pen them while I was sitting
Mm.
next to him and explain to me why he was doing it and explain the changes. And he is still someone I consider a friend. I always say he taught me most everything I know. I think about the things he taught me regularly still now, more than 10 years later when I'm working.
I think most people who work with an editor, I think most people's experience is that you email like a Word document to an editor, and then you wait and wait and wait for those changes to come back, and then you open it and you see all of the track changes in there, and your heart kind of sinks, but at least you don't have to look them in the eye. I can only imagine sitting next to them and just melting. That has to be.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I definitely understand, that you consider that a gift now, but in the when it first started happening, I can only imagine the dread that came with that.
Yeah, because it's not, I mean, it's a very rewarding experience in the long term, but when it
In the
first
long term.
happens, right, when it first happens, it's not gentle, right? And
Right,
it's you're just sort of put face to face with the fact that you're not as good as you want to be yet, and you have so much to learn, and it's
right.
okay, but it can be a painful place to be in as well.
Wow. I have a good friend who is German, and his first language is German, of course, but he has been in the U.S. for maybe 20 years now, and he writes novels. And I asked him before, when you sit down to write, does your mind ever write in German, and then you have to translate on the fly, or is it just a gear that shifts? You know, you being a native French speaker, um, writing in English, is that ever an issue? I get, you know, a lot of us that are not bilingual maybe don't quite understand what that process is like.
It was a little daunting at first. It was definitely something, my mindset was, I'm going to try to write a novel in English and we'll see if I can. I wasn't sure. But I also wonder just how different that is from the mindset of anyone who sits down to write a novel.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, every novel feels like the first one. We have no idea how to write this specific novel, and we have to figure it out. And especially from the point of view of the voice, I think with every new novel, you have to find the voice and you have to find your way around it so that it kind of sings to you. And I had to find a voice in English for this book, and I had to find a voice for each of the characters who have a point of view in the novel. And it was a process, but I don't know if it was that different fundamentally from the work that a native speaker would have had to do. Um, there is an aspect that is a little bit tricky, but it's just it has made me very careful. That's something I do in journalism as well. I'm always a little paranoid that a word doesn't mean what I think it means.
Mm.
And so I will like, go on wordreference.com and translate random words, even words that I know perfectly well what they mean, but
Right.
just in case. And then every once in a while I find a surprise. I still think that the word saunter sounds like it means the exact opposite of what it means. I will never accept that it means that. So that was a change actually that I had to make in the manuscript of the Quiet Tenant. There was a saunter in there that was not supposed to be here.
Well, as a native English speaker, there are plenty of times where I need to just make sure that that means what I think it means.
Yes, yeah, it's always
Yeah.
good to check.
Right, exactly. So your new book, The Quiet Tenant, is it is a thriller about a serial killer. I don't think I'm giving away too much by just, you know, the premise, but it is told with a unique voice structure that that I've not seen before. I've read lots of crime fiction told from the point of view of the serial killer, and you're not sure, is this a reliable narrator? Is it not? And that's part of the fun, if you will, is, you know, is this guy telling us the truth or not? You chose to tell this story not from his point of view. So, first off, um, what was the moment of creation for this book for you? And what I mean by that is, in one moment, a book like The Quiet Tenant doesn't exist at all, and then either you're thinking about either a true story that you read about, or maybe you reported on, or you know, you're just sitting there in your imagination, and a character walks onto the stage of your mind, and you're like, who are you? And then, you know, you start kind of digging this story out of the ground, and then as the writer, it's your job to polish it up and excavate it, and then it does exist, and, you know, and then it's your job to write it out. What was that first moment of creation like for you?
So the Quiet Tenant started for me in April of 2020, which
Very
was
specific time.
uh-huh. It was exactly a very specific time, just very heightened, very, very strange period. And
With
I
nothing
was
going on in the world.
just nothing at all. you
Right.
know. And and in that chaos and with the anxiety of the times, I happened to be in a house in upstate New York, where the novel is actually set.
Right.
And I was with my husband and his parents. And we all knew what everyone in that group did for a living. We all knew theoretically how everyone spent their days. But suddenly we were all home all the time, and we could see how everyone spent their days hour by hour and minute by
Right.
minute. And I started thinking, because the mind wanders, when you're home all day, um, what if someone had a very dark secret that they had been able to keep only because of the distance that is baked into our schedules with our commutes and our jobs. And that means that we're away from the people who are closest to us for most hours of the day. And what if suddenly that distance was threatened? How do you handle that secret? And I took the pandemic element out. There's no
Yeah.
pandemic in the novel, but I kept this idea of worlds colliding and of someone's circumstances changing in a way that might expose them. And that's how I ended up writing the story of a serial killer who is known to his community as the seemingly perfect man whom everyone loves. And he lives on this relatively large property where he has kept one of his victims captive in his garden shed. And she's his only surviving victim. He's murdered all the other ones. And one day he has to move from this property to a smaller house that doesn't have a shed, and he decides or is manipulated into bringing his captive victim to live in the new house with himself and his teenage daughter, who doesn't know about her father's crimes. And he thinks his victim is too brainwashed to attempt to escape, which is definitely a bet that he is making. And there is another female character who also has a voice in the book, who is this woman who has a bit of a crush on this man. She doesn't know about his crimes either, and she's going to try to get closer to him with no idea of what she's walking into. And so the novel is told mainly through the three female voices of the captive victim, the
Right.
love interest, and the teenage daughter, plus a few sprinkled throughout.
Which is an interesting clash of worlds, when you've got this person who's a victim, this person, his daughter, who's an unwitting victim, if you want to look at it that way,
Yeah.
and then this love interest that are all coming from different perspectives. So we get a little bit of that, the thing that we love about an unreliable narrator, where we're not sure what's coming. We still get a bit of that from the different perspectives, which I thought was a really interesting choice.
Yeah, they're kind of unwittingly unreliable narrators,
Right.
right? Because they all
They all
think
have
they
a different
knew,
perception of who this guy is.
right, without realizing how incomplete their perceptions are.
Right.
Uh, but for me, that was really a way to paint a full picture of this kind of character, of this serial killer character, was to ask the people around him more than asking him directly. And to really because I think that was a way to really represent the way he occupies the world. Serial killers spend most of their days not doing what they're the most infamous for, right? They
Right.
go to work, they have families, they have children, they go about the world. And I wanted to try to represent that entire experience.
Yeah. When you told your family that because I've spent time with you guys, I now have written a novel about a serial killer, what's their reaction like to that?
Oh, yes, that was really funny. When I started writing this novel, it was my little project. I didn't think anyone was ever going to read it, which I think is the mindset one needs to have, by the way, to write a book. I think if you
Sure.
start thinking that people are going to read it, it's too jarring.
Yeah.
And you need to just be by yourself doing having your weird little fun.
Yeah.
And then I got the book deal with Knopf, and then the 30 foreign deals that followed. And that's when I had to go to my in-laws and say, by the way, I've written a serial killer book. It's going to be published. And also the house in it, actually, the house that the serial killer moves into with his victim and his daughter, it shares kind of a blueprint with my in-laws' house. The
Mm.
first floor is very similar to theirs. So I had to introduce that element as well to them. By the way, it's based on your house. That's
Oh,
cool. And they were very supportive. They were very happy, very excited. I've been very lucky. There was no, how dare you use our house in this manner. So now they're very excited. I mean, they were very intrigued when they finally got to read it because I made them wait until it was edited. So they read it on the like on an actual galley. So it took a few months. I think for months I kept them in the dark, which in retrospect was a bit wild.
That is. Um, were there because you have worked in the reality of these sorts of crimes in the past, were there um, certain stories that inspired events in the book? Were there little snippets from real events that you pulled in?
Yes, I think when I was building my serial killer character was when I sort of pulled from reality a little bit, with the caveat that I always try to have my novelist brain and my journalist brain communicate only on an as needed basis. I don't want to sit down to interview someone as a journalist and for them to have to worry that something's going to come up in a book. But I
Right.
do, but as far as building a library of personal knowledge goes, knowing how these things work, I think that's all fine, and part of the work of a novelist is to research
Yeah.
those things. But my serial killer character, whose name is Aiden, I wanted him to feel like he could have been real. But at the same time, I didn't want him to feel like the fictional avatar of a specific real serial killer.
Sure. Sure.
And so I started doing something that I thought of as building him from parts. So I took some aspects of Ted Bundy.
Yeah.
Ted Bundy was a law school dropout, like me, actually.
The the
And
charismatic everyman kind of. Yeah.
and so my serial killer character became a different kind of school dropout, but
Yeah.
that was inspired by that. I took a bit from Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer was one of multiple serial killers I'd read about who had a background in the military, and so my serial killer became a former Marine.
Mm.
Um, on the opposite end of that spectrum, a few of the serial killers I read about had problems with alcohol abuse. And so I made my serial killer character sober because I was sort of trying to differentiate him a little bit.
Sure.
So that kind of happened, and then I looked into, just as a in the background of my brain, I did read about some famous cases of people who were held captive for years, just to try to understand the mindset and try to understand how those experiences happen in real life. Um, Having grown up in Europe, I was familiar with the case of a woman named Natasha Kampusch who was held captive for years. She was kidnapped when she was a girl. And one day, her captor made her clean his car, and she was vacuum cleaning it. She had the vacuum cleaner on, and he stepped away to make a phone call, and she left the vacuum cleaner on, and she ran. And that's how she escaped. And she like, I think
Wow.
she like knocked on a couple of neighbors' doors, and one of them was scared, and so she had to go to another house and ask them to call the police. And it was just this unbelievable, and she'd been held captive for years, but it was this, I think that case for me did a lot of work in understanding that those stories of escape, the planets have to align. The
Right.
circumstances materially have to be right, and the mindset. The person has to believe that they
Yeah.
have a chance to make it out alive if they try to bolt, for
And
it to
the
work.
stakes are so high because if it's a failed attempt, it's gonna be twice as bad for them, you have to assume. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, it could mean death, right?
Right, right. When you're developing characters for your book, we've got Aiden, the actual perpetrator, and then we've got the 3 women who we experience this story through their experiences. Um, do you plan these characters out before you start the writing, or do you discover these characters as you kind of start writing the story and kinda get a feel for it? I guess what I'm asking is do you have a firm feel for the characters and then start speaking through them, or do they come alive on the page if as it were?
So it depends on the characters. Aiden and his captive victim were always part of the project from day one. And at first, I knew Aiden would have a daughter, but I didn't know she was going to get to speak as one of the narrators of this story. And the love interest I actually added uh, while I was already 10 or 20,000 words into the first draft. Um, Originally, it was just going to be the point of view of the captive victim.
Right.
Because I don't know, to me, she's the main character, and that was the story I wanted to tell. But at the same time, I felt that her point of view was a little limited because she only sees one side of this man, the side that he shows her. And one evening, I was walking my dog and I was listening to a song from the 90s that is very much a party tune, not at all a thriller song. And I thought suddenly, oh, what if there was this other point of view from this woman who has a crush on him? And what if she suddenly tries to, get closer to him? And that would be bad for everyone involved.
Yeah.
Um, and it was exciting, but I didn't know if it was actually a good idea. And I talked to a friend about it, and she said, "Well, try it, and if it doesn't work, you can always remove it." And I said, "Oh yes, that makes sense. We can always remove it." And so I started incorporating her. But I think there's another aspect to your question, which I think is very interesting: is do I know them through and through from the beginning, or do I get to know them while I write? And I
Right.
think for me, when I start writing, I think I need to have a grip on what their psychological transformation is going to be.
Mhm.
Um, but I also know they're going to surprise me on the page, and they always do. And I get to know them by writing. So whether it be figuring out their past or what makes them tick, or particularly in the case of the teenage daughter in this book, figuring out their voice. That's work that happens during the writing process. And I think that's the best part for me. When I was writing this book, I often felt like the director of a movie putting various actors together and seeing who has chemistry together. And some
Right.
characters, you put them in a scene together and you can just watch them. And it's just always fascinating. So I do get to know them on the way.
I love it. One of the most terrifying things about this book, and I say that with all love and respect, is that is that your that Aiden is such a three-dimensional character. We see the good in him. We see the horrible, the detestable, but his outward facing self is such a good guy, and that is more terrifying, I think, in a flat two-dimensional mustache twirling, evil bad guy, whatever. We all know that that is a fictional account, but when someone could be your next door neighbor, and what are they doing behind their door? That is terrifying. When did you was there a point in the writing where you're like, "Oh, I cracked the code on this guy. This is," was there a time where you realized, "Oh, he's gonna be more evil than I anticipated because this is just gonna scare people too much."
It's so funny. I never thought about the I don't think I was actively trying to make the book scary.
Yeah.
Because the idea of making a novel scary or making a novel suspenseful, that sounds like an impossible task, and it sounds very overwhelming. But I did want to capture the duality that you spoke about, and I I did it, he did I did have to, sort of work to wrap my head around him and to understand how different people experienced him. And I think that's why I ended up writing this story from multiple points of view, because I think sometimes it's easier to understand someone if we view them through the prism of the people who interacted with them in life. But it's hard. It's a hard duality to hold in your brain, the good and the bad, the, the meaningful good things that a character like this might have done for some people, and the despicable cruelty that they might have displayed against others. I mean, I think that's the whole reason I wrote this novel, is I needed 90,000 words to make sense of it, because it's
Yeah.
really hard to hold in your head.
Well, we'll finish with this question, but I've often wondered, um, journalists who become fiction writers, is it a good feeling to take this scenario and have the control to play out the scenario to the end? Because so many times we see a real life situation, and whether you're reporting on it or you're watching the reporting, there's nothing you can do about it. You either are just conveying the facts, or you're absorbing the facts from someone else, but there's no control over it. But as a fiction writer, you're kind of the god of the world, and um, horrible things can still happen. But does being a fiction writer feel like that there's a way to sort of write the world?
Absolutely. I think you've hit the nail on the head here. A big thing for me as a journalist who started writing fiction was that I wanted to call the shots. I wanted to also I wanted to answer questions that reality just would not provide an answer for. If you're interested in stories of crime, especially infamous stories of very, very rare types of crime, like serial killer stories, there is always a part of unknown in those stories. How many victims? Was this person a victim of this serial killer? How did they get away? Like, there's always these parts of shadow that no matter how hard we try, I don't think those answers can be found out. And I think fiction is where we get to care for these parts of ourselves that can't help but wander, and we
Right.
get to provide answers. But also, yes, I do get to, like, I know everything about this story, and you do have to follow the direction that the story wants to take, right? Like,
Sure.
but we are allowed to allow it to evolve organically and grow in a way that is very liberating compared to being tied to reality in journalism.
Right. Well, The Quiet Tenant is available everywhere now. Go visit your local bookstore, support local books, pick up a copy. If you don't have a great local bookstore, we'll put links to it in the show notes where you can grab it on Amazon or Audible. I I'm taking some vacation time around Independence Day next week, and I have the audiobook that I have not begun yet, but I'm waiting until I can lay by the pool in the sunshine and listen to it without being scared.
Oh,
So
wonderful. That make
I
watch
love
out.
it.
I narrate a chapter.
Do
So
you really?
yes, keep an ear out. Yes, it's a little Easter
Oh,
egg.
okay. I can't wait for that. That's we'll put a link to the Audible as well. Clemence, if people are just learning about you and discovering your work, is there a place online where they can follow along with all the great stuff that's going on with you?
Yes, absolutely. I am on Instagram at Clemence Michallon, all one word. And it's difficult to spell, but it is on the cover of the book.
Yeah.
And then I'm on Twitter at Clemence underscore MCLL. And these are the two places I use the most.
Excellent. We'll link those up to make it easy for folks to find you. Clemence, this has been so much fun chatting. Love the book. We're sending everyone to pick up a copy of it. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the great, really thoughtful questions. This was a treat. So thank you so much, and thank you for loving the book.